Hello, and thank you all for listening in today. My name is Kat Rhodes, and I'm a Materials Management Regional Specialist with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Today, along with the other regional specialists from around the state, we'll be discussing the new Opportunity to Recycle requirements for local governments that have come from the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, or RMA. Before we get started, we're going to take a minute to have all the regional specialists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Lexi Meek out of the Northwest region.
Hi, my name is Gretchen Sandow, and I work in the Northwest region.
Hi, I'm Lori Gordon, and I am the Regional Specialist for Eastern Region based out of the Bend office.
Hi, I'm Kathy Brown, a Regional Specialist in DEQ's Eugene office, and I cover materials management in Southwest Oregon counties, including Coos, Curry, Douglas, Jackson, Josephine, and Lane.
Great, thank you all. A few things to mention before we get started. Although many of the rules we'll be talking about today have been finalized, there are some that are still going through the rulemaking process. Therefore, some of the requirements we are talking about in this presentation may change in the future. We'll be sure to keep you informed of any changes that may impact local governments. Also in this presentation, we'll be discussing the requirements for local governments, although we completely understand that these changes will also have an impact on the local government service providers. Here's the agenda for what we will be going over in this presentation today. We will start with a quick overview of RMA and how it will work. Then we'll do a review of the Opportunity to Recycle requirements, also known as the OTR requirements, as they were prior to the 2023 rule changes. Next, we'll talk about which OTR requirements have changed due to RMA, when those changes go into effect, and what that means for local governments around the state. We'll then take a look at the new recycling acceptance lists for local governments and for the producer responsibility organizations. Then we'll discuss the upcoming funding opportunities for local governments and introduce you to the funding authorization process. This process will allow local governments to designate or authorize their service providers to receive funding on a local government's behalf. And lastly, we'll point out some high-level implementation timelines. Let's do a quick overview of RMA and how it will work. RMA introduces a shared responsibility approach to Oregon's recycling system. Producers of certain materials will now share in the responsibility with local governments, ratepayers, and customers to help manage our recyclable materials in Oregon. This is how our new system will work. Producers of covered products, which include packaging, printing and writing paper, and food serviceware, will join and pay fees to a producer responsibility organization, or PRO. The PRO will help fund their obligated responsibilities that will make Oregon's recycling system more convenient, accessible, and resilient. Just to note, the prospective PRO here in Oregon is Circular Action Alliance. If you are contacted by Circular Action Alliance, we encourage you to engage in discussion with them, as they are working closely with DEQ, local governments, and service providers to make investments to improve Oregon's recycling system. Next, DEQ has established new statewide recycling acceptance lists. These lists will help make recycling programs more consistent across the state, with the intent of making recycling easier, clearer, and more equitable. There will be a list of materials that local governments are responsible for collecting en route and at depots. The other list will be the materials that the PRO are responsible for collecting. We'll talk more about those lists later on in the presentation. Also, as some of you may be aware, from January to April in 2023, DEQ performed the first statewide needs assessment survey, which allowed local governments to indicate if they were interested in expanding recycling services in their jurisdiction. If a local government participated in the survey, they became eligible to receive funding from the PRO for expansion of existing or new recycling services. DEQ is required to periodically conduct a needs assessment survey, so if you miss the first one, you'll have a chance to participate in the future. As for education, the PRO will be creating new educational resources and media campaigns that local governments can use to promote the new statewide collection list. In addition, PRO funding will be available for educational materials that local governments can use to promote the reduction of contamination by households and businesses. And lastly, DEQ will permit or certify commingled recycling processing facilities that sort our recyclables, requiring them to meet new performance standards. These include standards for sorting quality, managing contamination, and reporting on the destination of materials, plus paying workers a living wage and providing supportive benefits. In addition, the PRO will pay the commingled recycling processing facilities 2 fees. One to offset the cost of removing contaminants, and the other to offset the cost of operating and absorb the volatility of recycling commodity markets. So that was a quick overview of RMA and how it will work. Now we're going to move on and Lexi's going to talk about the opportunity recycle requirements.
Thanks, Kat. Okay, let's talk about the opportunity to recycle requirements for local governments. There are 4 important rules that we're going to be discussing today, and those include the general requirements, local government recycling program elements, waste prevention program elements, and the waste recovery goals. Let's start with an overview of the general requirements prior to any changes due to the RMA. Starting with the rules that apply to all of the waste sheds, here are some of the high points. Under the general requirements, permitted solid waste facilities must ensure a place for collecting source-separated recyclables is located at the facility or provide recycling depot in a more convenient location, unless the facility is otherwise exempted in rules, such as a transfer station that's not open to the public. This rule also requires that cities within the Metro Service District and cities with a population over 4,000 provide on-route collection of source-separated recyclable materials at least once a month. And lastly, it requires that local governments provide general education on recycling opportunities in their jurisdictions. Next, let's move on to the local government recycling and waste prevention program elements. Cities over 4,000 in population and the county responsible for the urban growth boundary of those cities are required to implement recycling program elements. There are 13 different recycling program elements listed in rule. The number of elements a local government must implement is based on the city's population and its distance to Portland. In general, the smaller cities and those farther away from Portland have to implement fewer recycling program elements, where those that are closer to Portland, where most recycling facilities are located, are required to do more. As a reminder, the city government is responsible for implementing the recycling programs within the city limits. However, the county government is responsible for implementing the same number of program elements outside of the city, but within the urban growth boundary of those cities. There are 7 waste prevention and reuse program elements. Implementation of these programs are required only for cities with a population of 10,000 and where the county population is over 100,000. The number of elements a local government must implement is again population-based. So cities with a population of 10,000 to 50,000 have to implement 3 elements, while cities with a population of 50,000 or more are required to implement 5 of the waste prevention program elements. For a quick glance, here's a list of the 13 recycling program elements a city over the population of 4,000 can choose from. In addition, here are the 7 waste prevention program elements a local government can choose from. Next, Gretchen is going to finish up the discussion on the opportunity to recycle requirements prior to the rule changes, and then she's going to jump into more detail about what has changed in rule due to the RMA.
Thanks, Lexi. Every waste shed, along with the state, have their own recovery goals that were self-selected back in 2015. The individual waste shed goals range from 15% to 64%, and the statewide goal for 2020 was 52%, and the statewide goal for 2025 is 55%. However, the most recently calculated statewide recovery rate is 37.7%. Increasing and improving current recovery of materials through implementation of RMA programs could help increase each waste shed and the state's recovery rates. Now that we've done an overview of RMA and the OTR requirements, let's dive into what has changed in the OTR requirements due to RMA and what requirements will be new for local governments around the state. There have been big additions to the general requirements, which we will cover in the next few slides. There have also been some changes to the recycling program elements, and there have been no changes to the waste prevention programs or the waste shed and statewide recovery goals. A brand new change for everyone is that there are now new statewide recycling acceptance lists. There is a list of materials that local governments will be responsible for collecting and a list of materials the PRO will be responsible for collecting. Lori will provide more details on those lists here soon. As mentioned, there have been significant changes to the OTR general requirements. The changes listed on this slide impact all local governments regardless of size. Most of these requirements go into effect July 1st, 2025. Let's talk about those changes now. First up is a change for the permitted facilities that must provide a recycling depot or provide a more convenient location as stated in the general requirements. The difference now is that they must collect the materials on the local government recycling acceptance list specifically for depots. For those of you who were familiar with the term principal recyclable materials, or PRMs, that was the former list of materials to be collected. Now, the PRMs no longer exist in rule and have been replaced with the local government recycling acceptance list. Second is that all local governments, service providers, or commingled recycling reload facilities must send all materials collected commingled in a cart to either a permitted in-state commingled recycling processing facility or to an approved and certified out-of-state facility. Next, the only materials allowed to be collected commingled in a recycle cart are the items on the uniform statewide collection list. Any other material that is not on the uniform statewide collection list is not allowed to be collected in the cart commingled. However, they are allowed to be collected separately on the side. And lastly, all local governments or their service providers must ensure that any new recycling or waste containers purchased after January 1st, 2026 contain at least 10% verified post-consumer recycled content. Let's move on to the changes in the general requirements that are only for cities with the population over 4,000. The requirement for a local government to provide at least monthly en-route collection of recyclable materials remains in rule. However, it is the list of materials that has changed. Local governments will now need to ensure that there is at least monthly collection of the materials listed on the local government recycling acceptance list. Next, to the extent that PRO funding is provided to local governments or their service providers, the local government will need to establish a program to reduce contamination that includes establishing a recycling contamination reduction goal that is consistent with the state's goal and implementing recycling contamination reduction programs. The state will create a list of contamination reduction program elements under 3 different categories. A local government will need to choose one program element from each of the categories to implement. The 3 categories are: number 1, providing customer-facing contamination reduction materials and methods that are responsive to diverse populations. Number 2, standards for providing feedback to generators who contribute to contamination that is responsive to diverse populations. And number 3, providing financial or service consequences to generators that are significant and repeated sources of contamination. Consequences must be responsive to diverse populations. Once DEQ has created the list of program elements under each category, the complete list will be made available to local governments. These elements will be structured similarly to the menu of options that are provided for the recycling program elements. In addition, local governments will be required to undergo a periodic evaluation of collected materials for quality and contamination. DEQ will be establishing forms and procedures to assist with this evaluation. Then, every 5 years, a local government will need to have a process for reviewing and revising the local contamination reduction goal and the contamination reduction program elements being implemented. And as a reminder, the local government programs to reduce contamination under this rule will only be required if funding is provided by the PRO. For education, a local government will be required to utilize and distribute education materials developed by the PRO for the promotion of the Uniform Statewide Collection List. The PRO will be required to consult with local governments during the development of these educational resources. The last of the changes to the general requirements regards recycling at multifamily properties. Currently, the rule requires that local governments must do 4 things. Number 1, ensure that there is adequate on-site space for the collection of recyclable materials. Number 2, demonstrate a plan that any newly constructed properties or properties that are undergoing significant remodels provide adequate space for recycling collection and access for collection vehicles. For instance, such a plan could include a change to local land use ordinances, building codes, and/or permitting requirements that would require adequate space and vehicle access. Number 3, update and establish service standards for service providers to ensure adequate volume, collection frequency, or a combination of both. And number 4, ensure that the placement of recycle containers is accessible to all residents, including children and those using wheelchairs. We would like you to know that although this is what the current rule states, DEQ is providing new rule language that could change what is required by local governments, including pushing the implementation date of this requirement out a few years. In addition, DEQ is currently undertaking a multifamily needs assessment that could make recommendations on how this requirement might be implemented, or it could recommend new funding responsibilities of the PRO. Please stay tuned for more information about how this requirement might change. Up next, Lori is going to finish providing information on the opportunity to recycle rules, and then we'll provide more information on the new recycling acceptance lists for local governments and the PRO.
Thanks, Gretchen. Now let's talk about the changes to the recycling program elements. As previously mentioned by Lexi, these changes are for cities with populations over 4,000 and their urban growth boundaries. Local governments that choose to implement Program Element B, the weekly residential en-route collection, Element D, the multifamily collection, or Element F, commercial collection, will now be required to collect all the materials on the local government acceptance list that have been designated for collection from service customers. And for those local governments that choose Program Element G, expanded recycling depots, will be required to collect the materials on the local government acceptance list for depots. What used to be called the Principal Recyclable Material List is no longer in rule and has been replaced with a list of materials in the new Recycling Acceptance List. Just a quick note, there have been no changes to the waste prevention program elements, the waste shed goals, or the state recovery goals. So let's shift gears and talk about the new recycling acceptance lists. These new lists can be found in rule under Oregon Administrative Rule 340-090-0630. There are now different types of recycling acceptance lists in this rule. To give you a better understanding of each of the lists, let's walk through the rule. The first part of the rule provides definitions for all of the materials on each list. The next part of the rule provides the list of materials that are on the local government recycling acceptance list. This includes materials to be collected en route and at regulated depots. A regulated depot is either a recycling depot that, if required, is located at a solid waste permitted facility at a more convenient location, or a recycling depot that a local government has chosen to provide to meet the requirements of Expanded Depot for Recycling Program Element G. Next in the rule is the list of materials that the PRO will be responsible for collecting, either through recycling depots, at mobile collection events. Lastly, the rule specifies which materials need to be collected, as well as where and how they're collected. For instance, Materials need to be collected at regulated depots. Other materials might need to be collected en route from collection service customers, while other materials are suitable to be collected commingled, which are the materials on the Uniform Statewide Collection List, or USCL. Here are all the materials that are required to be collected at least monthly from en route service customers in cities with populations over 4,000. This also coincides with the materials on the Uniform Statewide Collection List as materials that are suitable to be put in a commingled cart. As a reminder, a material that is not on the Uniform Statewide Collection List cannot be put in a commingled cart. Materials on the list do not need to be collected, commingled. They can be separated out if that's what the local government prefers. Along with the materials on the previous slide, motor oil and scrap metal, including appliances, are required to be collected at regulated depots unless the rule specifies otherwise. As a reminder, regulated depots are either a recycling depot, if required, is located at a solid waste permitted facility or at a more convenient location, or a recycling depot that a local government has chosen to provide to meet the requirements of expanded depot for recycling program element G. The two materials on the bottom of the slide, glass and yard debris, are only required for collection in the Portland metro region. So let's move on to the list of materials that the Pro will be responsible for collecting. The Pro must provide for collection of these materials either through a recycling depot, a mobile collection event, or other arrangements for collection of materials on the Pro acceptance list. Next, Kathy will talk about some of the requirements for the collection of Pro materials.
Thank you, Lori. We want to mention just a few things about requirements the Pro will have for the collection of Pro materials. There will be convenience standards associated with the collection of materials on the Pro list, which means the Pro will be required to have a certain number of these depots or events in different areas around the state. The number of collection points is based on a county or city's population. And if you want, you can find these specifications in OAR 340-090-0640. The Pro will also be required to meet performance standards and adhere to responsible end market requirements related to the collection of materials on the Pro acceptance list. We're not going to go into detail of the Pro requirements. However, we did want to mention one of the convenience standards for the Pro as it could impact local governments and their service providers. This is the requirement that before setting up collection depots or events, the Pro must first attempt to contract or partner with an existing recycling depot to see if they're interested in providing for the collection of Pro materials. What this means is that the Pro would be covering the costs for the existing depot to collect Pro materials. To be clear, existing depots do not have to partner with the Pro to collect the Pro materials. The existing depot can decline the offer and continue collecting the materials on the depot acceptance list. However, if an existing depot does want to contract with the Pro to collect the Pro materials, they will then be subject to the performance standards in rule and be required to send materials to a responsible end market. Now let's move on to the topic of funding. Although funding is not a local government requirement, we're going to give you an overview of the different types of funding that local governments will be eligible to receive from the Pro. It's indicated in ORS 459A.890. Eligible costs for Pro funding or reimbursement to local governments includes: one, we've got recycling service expansion, and it's identified in the needs assessment. Now, this was for local governments that requested new or expanded recycling opportunities during the needs assessment survey DEQ performed during the first quarter of 2023. Those identified needs are eligible for funding or reimbursements. This applies to all local governments that participated in the needs assessment, regardless of the city size. Eligible costs cover two different collection options. One is for the en route programs. There you have startup costs that include, and it's not limited to, is trucks, containers, promotional literature, and if necessary and none other is available, a recycling reload facility for reloading recyclables. And that would include compaction or baling equipment that would be needed for a recycling reload facility. The other is for recycling depots, and the expenses could be for containers, on-site monitoring equipment, site preparation or other startup costs or operational costs, including staffing. These are all eligible expenses for reimbursement for depots. And the PRO will be reaching out to local governments or designated service providers to determine the requested services. Now, let's talk about the eligible costs for funding of reimbursement towards transportation. This applies to the cost for transporting covered products more than 50 miles from a recycling depot or a recycling reload facility to the nearest commingled recycling processing facility or a responsible end market. This will include the cost to receive, consolidate, load, and transport covered products. Third, we've got contamination reduction programming. The cost of contamination reduction programming for residential and commercial customers required by ORS 459A.929. These were discussed earlier in the presentation. And if you recall, it's the PRO will provide advance funding or reimbursement of $3 per capita per year. All local governments, regardless of size, could be eligible for this funding if they're implementing the contamination reduction programming. Fourth, we've got the PRO will provide funding for or reimbursement for the costs associated with doing the contamination evaluation of collected recyclable materials required by local governments. That is if the evaluation occurs at a location other than a commingled recycling processing facility. Number 5, finally, is the cost of complying with ORS 459A.908. And that is what requires a local government to purchase new collection containers with 10% post-consumer recycled content. Will be covered to the extent that the use of post-consumer recycled material is more expensive than the lowest priced alternative. Next, let's talk about the authorization process and how it's going to work. The RMA allows a local government to authorize and designate a service provider or other entities, such as a county or other partner, to receive PRO funding or reimbursement directly on behalf of the local government. The local government that would like to authorize a service provider or other entity to receive PRO funding on its behalf must make this designation to DEQ. A local government may choose to make this designation for all eligible funding types that we just discussed, or for some of the eligible funding types, or for none at all. DEQ will create and send out the authorization forms to local governments with the opportunity recycle reports in December 2024. The authorization forms are due back to DEQ in spring of 2025. However, please start thinking about whether your local government would like to make the authorization now, as this process may require meetings with city councils, county boards, or getting other types of approvals, which could take several months. Lastly, let's go over some of the important deadlines coming up. This year, the second Rulemaking Advisory Committee has concluded, and DEQ expects to post the second rule language package in June for public comment. The PRO program plan was due and has been submitted, and the first equity study and multifamily needs assessment be completed. As I just mentioned, the authorization form for local government to designate their service providers for PRO funding will be sent out in December 2024 and will be due in spring of 2025. July 1st, 2025, many of the new local government requirements will begin, and the PRO will begin implementing their program plan, and recycling processors will obtain permits, certification, or approval from DEQ. Then on January 1st, 2026, containers purchased by a local government or service provider will need to contain at least 10% post-consumer content. And then in July 2026, the multifamily requirements could begin. Now let's go back to Kat to wrap things up.
Great. Thank you, Lexi, Gretchen, Lori, and Kathy. To stay informed and to receive the most up-to-date information about RMA, we encourage you to sign up for the RMA newsletter through GovDelivery. In addition, the regional specialists will be sending local governments and service providers updated information throughout the year, so be on the lookout for information from your local regional specialists. We all want to thank you for listening into our presentation. We know that we've given you a lot of information and that you will likely have questions. Here's a list of our contact information, so please reach out with any questions or concerns that you may have about RMA or the opportunity recycle requirements. We all look forward to working with you in the future.